The morning mist clung to the Hudson River Valley like a shroud of destiny on September 19th, 1777. General John Burgoyne stood atop a small hill near Freeman's Farm, his elaborate uniform pristine despite the wilderness campaign that had brought his army this far south from Canada. The British commander's confidence had not yet been shaken by the reality that would soon engulf him, that this day would mark the beginning of the end for British hopes in the American colonies. Gentleman Johnny, as his soldiers called him, had begun his campaign with supreme optimism. His plan was elegant in its simplicity: march south from Montreal, capture Albany, and split the rebellious colonies in two. The strategy had the full backing of Lord Germain in London, who believed that severing New England from the southern colonies would crush the rebellion within months. Burgoyne commanded nearly 8,000 men, including British regulars, German mercenaries, Canadian militia, and Native American allies, a formidable force by any measure. But as the British general surveyed the dense forest ahead, he could not have imagined that American forces under General Horatio Gates were already positioning themselves for what would become one of the most decisive battles in world history. The Americans had learned of Burgoyne's approach weeks earlier. Through their extensive network of spies and sympathizers, Gates, a former British officer who had thrown his lot in with the colonial cause, had chosen his ground carefully at Bemis Heights, a strategic position that commanded the river road to Albany. The American camp buzzed with nervous energy as soldiers from across the colonies prepared for battle. Among them was Benedict Arnold, still a patriot hero at this time, whose aggressive tactics and battlefield courage had made him one of Washington's most trusted commanders. Daniel Morgan's Virginia riflemen checked their weapons with practiced precision, their long rifles capable of accuracy that British soldiers found unnerving. These frontier fighters represented a new kind of warfare that European armies were only beginning to understand. According to historical accounts documented in the Smithsonian's comprehensive analysis of the Revolutionary War, the stage was set for a confrontation that would reshape the global balance of power. The British Army, despite its reputation for invincibility, was about to face an enemy that had learned to use the American wilderness to its advantage. As dawn broke on that fateful September morning, neither side fully comprehended the magnitude of what was about to unfold. Burgoyne's army began its advance through the thick woods, the sound of drums and fifes echoing through the trees. The general had divided his forces into 3 columns, believing that his superior training and discipline would carry the day against what he still considered a rabble of colonial farmers and merchants. But the Americans were no longer the disorganized militia that had fled in panic at battles like Brandywine. Months of drilling under Baron von Steuben had transformed the Continental Army into a disciplined fighting force. More importantly, they were fighting on their home ground, defending their families and their nascent nation's dream of independence. The psychological advantage of fighting for one's homeland would prove as valuable as any military strategy. The first shots rang out around noon, echoing through the forest like thunder, announcing the storm to come. Freeman's Farm, a small clearing in the wilderness, would become the epicenter of a battle that would determine whether the American Revolution would succeed or fail, and whether European powers would dare to challenge British supremacy on the seas and in the New World. The battle erupted with shocking violence as British forces under Major General Simon Fraser advanced through the dense woodland toward Freeman's Farm. The crack of muskets and the deeper boom of artillery pieces shattered the morning silence, sending flocks of birds wheeling into the smoke-filled sky. What Burgoyne had envisioned as a coordinated assault quickly devolved into a chaotic melee. As his columns became separated in the thick forest, Daniel Morgan's riflemen had positioned themselves expertly among the trees, their hunting experience serving them well in this wilderness warfare. Unlike the British soldiers, who had trained for European-style battles fought in open fields with knee formations, these American frontiersmen understood how to use every tree, every fallen log, every depression in the ground as cover. Their long rifles, crafted by German gunsmiths in Pennsylvania, could kill a man at distances that made British officers feel helpless and exposed. The fighting at Freeman's Farm raged for nearly 4 hours, with neither side able to claim decisive victory. British discipline and bayonet charges would drive the Americans back, only to have them melt into the woods and reform elsewhere. The Redcoats found themselves fighting ghost enemies, who appeared from behind trees, fired with deadly accuracy, and vanished before British soldiers could close with them. It was a preview of guerrilla warfare that would not become common military doctrine for another century. Benedict Arnold, against direct orders from Gates to remain in camp, threw himself into the battle with characteristic fury, riding among the troops. He rallied wavering American units and led them back into the fight. His presence on the battlefield electrified the colonial soldiers, who saw in Arnold the embodiment of American defiance against British tyranny. None could have predicted that this same man would later betray the cause he now fought for with such passion. Major General Fraser, commanding the British right wing, found his advance stalled by fierce American resistance. The veteran Scottish officer had fought in campaigns across Europe and had never encountered enemies who fought with such unconventional tactics. His soldiers, weighed down by heavy equipment and constrained by rigid military doctrine, struggled to adapt to this new form of warfare. Fraser himself would later write to his superiors about the diabolical accuracy of the American rifle men. As the afternoon wore on, casualties mounted on both sides, but the Americans demonstrated a resilience that surprised British commanders. Colonial soldiers who were wounded often returned to the fight after rudimentary treatment, driven by a conviction that their cause was just. British casualties, meanwhile, were difficult to replace so deep in enemy territory, far from reinforcements and supply lines. The psychological impact of the battle extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. For the first time in the campaign, Burgoyne's supposedly invincible army had been fought to a standstill by colonial forces. Word of the engagement spread quickly through both camps, boosting American morale while planting seeds of doubt among British troops, who had been assured of easy victory. When darkness finally brought an end to the fighting, both armies remained on the field. Though the British technically held Freeman's Farm, however, Burgoyne had paid a terrible price for this Pyrrhic victory. His casualties numbered over 600 men, including many irreplaceable officers and sergeants. The Americans, fighting from cover and able to withdraw wounded men more easily, had lost fewer than 300 soldiers. More critically, the battle had demonstrated to watching European powers that the American Continental Army could stand toe-to-toe with British regulars and fight them to a stalemate. French observers, already sympathetic to the American cause, but wary of backing what might prove to be a losing proposition, began to reconsider their position. The path to French intervention and ultimate American victory had been opened by the blood spilled in a small clearing in the New York wilderness. In the weeks following the first battle at Freeman's Farm, General Burgoyne found himself in an increasingly precarious position. His army, once a formidable force of invasion, had become trapped like a great beast caught in a snare that tightened with each passing day. The general's supply lines stretched precariously back to Canada, constantly harassed by American militia, who struck like wolves at his baggage trains and communication posts. Meanwhile, American forces under General Gates continued to swell with reinforcements. Militia units poured in from across New England and New York, answering the call to defend their homeland against foreign invasion. These were not professional soldiers in the European sense, but farmers, craftsmen, and merchants who had left their plows and workshops to take up arms. Their very presence around Burgoyne's army created an atmosphere of siege that slowly strangled British hopes of reaching Albany. The weather began to turn as October arrived, bringing cold rains that turned roads into muddy quagmires and made every movement a struggle. Burgoyne's Native American allies, sensing the shifting tide of fortune, began to desert in increasing numbers. These warriors had joined the British expecting quick victories and profitable raids, not a grinding campaign that seemed to offer little prospect of success. Their departure left Burgoyne blind to American movements and vulnerable to surprise attacks. Food became increasingly scarce in the British camp. Soldiers who had marched south with full bellies now subsisted on reduced rations, their strength ebbing as the siege mentality took hold. Horses, essential for artillery and cavalry operations, began to die from lack of proper fodder. The magnificent army that had confidently descended from Canada was slowly wasting away in the American wilderness, far from home and surrounded by enemies. General Horatio Gates, meanwhile, demonstrated the patience of a spider waiting for prey to exhaust itself in his web. The American commander resisted pressure from subordinates, like Benedict Arnold, to launch immediate attacks, preferring to let time and attrition work in his favor. Gates understood that every day Burgoyne remained trapped strengthened the American position. A weakened British resolve According to military historians referenced in the National Archives' comprehensive study of Revolutionary War strategy, Gates' defensive approach represented a sophisticated understanding of asymmetric warfare. The Americans did not need to destroy Burgoyne's army in a single climactic battle. They needed only to prevent his escape while demonstrating to European observers that British forces could be contained and ultimately defeated. The psychological pressure on British soldiers became intense as October progressed. These men had enlisted expecting to serve in a victorious army that would quickly crush colonial rebellion and return home covered in glory. Instead, they found themselves increasingly isolated, surrounded by hostile forces in an alien landscape. Desertion began to increase, with soldiers slipping away into the night despite the harsh penalties that awaited those caught attempting to flee. Burgoyne himself maintained an outward facade of confidence, but his private correspondence revealed growing desperation. Letters to his superiors in London became increasingly urgent, pleading for reinforcements that would never come. General Henry Clinton in New York had his own problems and could spare no significant forces to rescue Burgoyne's trapped army. Lord Cornwallis was engaged in the Southern campaign, leaving Burgoyne to face his fate alone in the Hudson Valley. The British general's options narrowed with each passing day. Retreat to Canada meant abandoning the entire campaign and admitting defeat a humiliation that could end his military career. Fighting his way south to Albany required breaking through American lines that grew stronger. Daily, standing still meant slow starvation and eventual surrender. None of these choices offered much hope, but Burgoyne was too proud and too committed to his mission to simply give up without one final desperate gamble. As October 7th approached, Burgoyne made his fateful decision to attempt one last offensive action. He would probe American defenses and, if possible, break through to Albany. If not, he would at least go down fighting rather than surrendering without a final battle. This decision would seal not only his own fate, but that of British hopes for victory in the American Revolution. October 7th, 1777 dawned crisp and clear, the autumn air carrying the scent of wood smoke and fallen leaves. General Burgoyne, driven by desperation and the slim hope of salvaging his campaign, ordered a reconnaissance in force against American positions. He personally led 1,500 of his best remaining troops in what would prove to be the final gamble of his military career. The British soldiers, despite weeks of hardship, maintained their discipline as they formed up for what many sensed might be their last battle. The probe began well enough for the British forces. Moving cautiously through the forest toward Bemis Heights, they encountered light resistance from American outposts. Burgoyne allowed himself a moment of hope that perhaps the colonial forces had weakened or withdrawn during the long siege. This optimism proved tragically misplaced, as American scouts quickly reported the British movement to General Gates, who immediately began positioning his forces to respond. Benedict Arnold, who had been effectively under arrest in his tent following heated arguments with Gates over strategy, could not contain himself when he heard the sound of battle beginning. Despite explicit orders to remain in camp, Arnold burst from his quarters, leaped onto his horse, and rode toward the sound of gunfire with the fury of a man possessed. His dramatic appearance on the battlefield would become the stuff of legend, inspiring American soldiers and striking fear into British hearts. The fighting that erupted was far more intense than the first battle at Freeman's Farm. American forces, now numbering over 11,000 men, attacked the British reconnaissance force from multiple directions. Daniel Morgan's riflemen again proved their worth, picking off British officers with their accurate long rifles and disrupting enemy formations before they could properly deploy. The psychological effect of seeing their leaders fall around them proved devastating to British morale. Arnold's presence transformed the American assault from a coordinated defense into a wild, aggressive offensive that caught the British completely off guard. Riding from unit to unit, Arnold rallied his men with passionate speeches and personal example. He led charges against British positions with such reckless courage that even enemy soldiers later expressed admiration for his bravery. His horse was shot from under him twice, but Arnold continued fighting on foot until another mount was brought to him. The climax of the battle came when Arnold, leading a mixed force of Continental soldiers and militia, stormed the Bremen Redoubt, a key fortification protecting the British right flank. The assault was so fierce and sudden that German defenders barely had time to load their muskets before Americans were among them with bayonets and tomatoes. Arnold himself was wounded in the leg during this attack, the same leg that had been injured at Quebec. but not before the redoubt had fallen to American forces. With their flank turn and their reconnaissance force in full retreat, Burgoyne's situation became hopeless. The British general ordered a general withdrawal to defensive positions near the village of Saratoga, but it was clear to all observers that his army was finished as an effective fighting force. Casualties from the day's fighting, combined with ongoing desertions and the impossibility of obtaining supplies, meant that surrender was now inevitable. The speed and violence of the American victory sent shockwaves through both armies. British soldiers, who had maintained their discipline through weeks of hardship, finally began to lose heart as they realized their situation was truly hopeless. American forces, meanwhile, were elated by their success and the knowledge that they had proven themselves capable of defeating the best troops Britain could send against them. News of the victory spread rapidly through the American colonies and across the Atlantic to European capitals. In Paris, French Foreign Minister Comte de Vergennes received reports of the battle with particular interest. The Americans had not merely survived British assault, they had decisively defeated a major British army in open battle. This demonstration of military capability was exactly what France had been waiting for. Before committing to open alliance with the rebellious colonies, the Battle of Bemis Heights, as it came to be known, lasted only a few hours but changed the course of world history. Burgoyne's army, once the pride of British forces in North America, was now trapped with no hope of escape or rescue. The stage was set for the surrender that would transform the American Revolution from a colonial rebellion into a global war against British power. The morning of October 17th, 1777 arrived gray and overcast, as if nature itself mourned what was about to unfold. General John Burgoyne stood in his tent, no longer the confident gentleman Johnny who had descended from Canada with such high hopes. His uniform, once immaculate, showed the wear of a campaign that had gone terribly wrong. Outside, his remaining soldiers prepared for the most humiliating moment in British military history: formal surrender to colonial forces. They had been taught to despise as inferior rabble. The negotiations had been delicate and drawn out over several days. Burgoyne, even in defeat, maintained his aristocratic pride and refused to accept unconditional surrender. Instead, he negotiated what became known as the Convention of Saratoga, an agreement that technically allowed his soldiers to return to Britain on the promise they would not serve again in North America. General Gates, eager to conclude the affair, and perhaps somewhat awed by the magnitude of his victory, agreed to these generous terms. As the ceremony began, nearly 6,000 British and German soldiers laid down their arms in a field near Saratoga. The sight was almost surreal. Line after line of professional soldiers, men who had served the crown across multiple continents, formally surrendering to an army that many Europeans still considered a collection of amateur militiamen. The psychological impact of this moment would resonate far beyond the Hudson Valley, shaking confidence in British invincibility throughout Europe. General Burgoyne approached the surrender ceremony with whatever dignity he could muster, meeting General Gates in a formal tableau that would be painted and reproduced countless times. He offered his sword in the traditional gesture of defeat. Gates, showing the courtesy expected between gentlemen officers, immediately returned the weapon, acknowledging Burgoyne's status as a fellow professional soldier despite their opposing causes. The British general's surrender speech revealed both his personal devastation and his attempt to maintain some semblance of honor. He acknowledged the courage and skill of American forces, while suggesting that his defeat resulted more from circumstances beyond his control than from any inherent superiority of his enemies. This face-saving rhetoric fooled no one present, but it allowed both sides to conduct the ceremony with appropriate dignity. Among the captured British forces were soldiers who had served in campaigns from India to the Caribbean, veterans who had never before tasted defeat. Their humiliation was complete as they marched past ranks of American soldiers, who maintained respectful silence during the surrender ceremony. Many of these British troops would later write about their shock at seeing the quality and discipline of the American forces, a far cry from the undisciplined mob they had expected to face. The German mercenaries, particularly the Hessian units that had comprised a significant portion of Burgoyne's army, faced a different fate than their British counterparts. Many would eventually settle in America rather than return to their homeland, adding their skills and knowledge to the growing American population. Their decision to remain represented another victory for the American cause, concrete proof that even hired soldiers could be won over by the promise of American freedom and opportunity. According to diplomatic correspondence preserved in the French National Archives and referenced by historian Jonathan Dole, in his definitive study of French involvement in the American Revolution, news of Saratoga's surrender reached Versailles on December 4, 1777. The reaction was immediate and electric. King Louis XVI, previously cautious about openly supporting the American rebels, now saw an opportunity to strike a devastating blow against France's traditional enemy. The surrender at Saratoga represented more than just a military defeat for Britain. It was a catastrophic failure of grand strategy, the plan to divide the colonies by controlling the Hudson Valley laying ruins, along with British prestige and the myth of invincibility that had protected the empire's far-flung territories. Colonial rebellions from Ireland to India would take hard from news that British forces could be defeated by determined local resistance. Perhaps most importantly, the victory provided American diplomats in Paris with the credibility they desperately needed to secure French alliance. Benjamin Franklin, the colonial representative who had been patiently cultivating French support, suddenly found doors opening that had previously remained closed. The Americans had proven they could win decisive victories against British forces now. They needed European support to transform their revolution into a successful war of independence. The elegant halls of Versailles buzzed with excitement and barely contained anticipation as news of Saratoga's aftermath rippled through the French court. Count Charles Gravier de Vergennes, the astute foreign minister who had been carefully monitoring the American situation, now saw the opportunity he had been waiting for since the rebellion began. The victory had transformed the Americans from desperate rebels seeking help into potential allies who had proven their military competence against Europe's most feared army. Benjamin Franklin, the aging philosopher-diplomat who had charmed Parisian society while secretly negotiating for French support, received word of the victory while attending a salon in Paris. The normally composed Franklin could barely contain his satisfaction as he realized that American fortunes had fundamentally changed. No longer would he need to plead for French assistance from a position of weakness. Now he could offer alliance between equals to strike at their common British enemy. King Louis XVI faced the most momentous decision of his reign. As his council debated the implications of Saratoga, conservative advisors warned of the enormous expense of war with Britain and questioned whether France's finances could support another global conflict. Progressive ministers, led by Vergennes, argued that this was France's best chance to recover from the humiliating defeats of the 7 Years' War and restore French prestige on the world stage. The king's decision was influenced not only by immediate strategic considerations, but by deeper currents of French policy that had shaped European politics. For decades, France and Britain had been locked in a struggle for global dominance that had played out across multiple continents and generations. The American Revolution offered France an unprecedented opportunity to strike at British power without directly challenging the Royal Navy in European waters. Secret negotiations between Franklin and French representatives intensified throughout the winter of 1777 to 1778. The discussions were delicate, involving not just military alliance, but complex questions of trade, territorial claims, and post-war arrangements. Franklin's diplomatic skill proved as valuable to the American cause as any general's battlefield tactics, as he maneuvered through the intricate world of European power politics. According to declassified diplomatic correspondence examined by the Library of Congress and detailed in their comprehensive study of Revolutionary War diplomacy, the final breakthrough came in February 1778. French negotiators, convinced by Saratoga that American victory was not only possible but probable, agreed to formal treaties of alliance and commerce that would bring France openly into the war against Britain. The Treaty of Alliance, signed on February 6, 1778, represented a diplomatic revolution that transformed the American Revolution into a global conflict. France committed not only to military and naval support, but also pledged not to make a separate peace with Britain, a promise that would bind French and American fortunes together for the remainder of the war. In return, America agreed to fight alongside France until British recognition of American independence was achieved. The immediate military implications were staggering. The French Navy, second only to Britain's in size and capability, would now challenge British control of American waters. French military engineers and officers would provide expertise that the Continental Army desperately needed. Most importantly, French financial resources would fund American military operations that might otherwise have collapsed due to lack of supplies and equipment. Spanish involvement, while more cautious and indirect than French participation, added another dimension to the expanding conflict. Spain's entry into the war in 1779 would stretch British resources even thinner, forcing the Royal Navy to protect territories from Gibraltar to the Caribbean, while maintaining blockades of American ports and supporting British armies in North America. The psychological impact of French alliance may have been even more significant than its immediate military benefits. American morale, already boosted by victory at Saratoga, soared with news that the most powerful monarchy in Europe had recognized their independence and pledged to support their cause. British morale, conversely, plummeted as leaders realized they now faced not just colonial rebellion, but a renewed global war against traditional enemies. The chain of events triggered by Burgoyne's surrender at Saratoga had fundamentally altered the strategic balance of the Revolutionary War. What had begun as a localized conflict between Britain and its American colonies had become a worldwide struggle that would determine the future balance of power among European nations. The victory in the New York wilderness had set in motion forces that would ultimately lead to American independence and reshape the global order. The reverberations of Saratoga's triumph continued to shape the Revolutionary War long after the last British prisoner had been marched away from the Hudson Valley. In the immediate aftermath of the victory and French alliance, the character of the conflict transformed dramatically. British strategy, previously focused on crushing colonial rebellion through decisive military action, shifted toward defending an empire under attack from multiple directions. The Royal Navy, once concentrated on blockading American ports, now had to protect British interests from the Caribbean to India. General Washington, whose Continental Army had endured the terrible winter at Valley Forge while Burgoyne was surrendering at Saratoga, found his strategic position fundamentally improved by the victory he had not directly participated in. French military supplies began flowing to American forces, providing the weapons, ammunition, and equipment that had been desperately scarce throughout the early years of the war. French military advisors, experienced in European warfare, helped train American officers in advanced tactics and siege warfare techniques. The British response to Saratoga and French entry into the war revealed the limitations of 18th century imperial power. Parliament, already divided over the American war, faced growing opposition as the conflict expanded beyond all original expectations. Lord North's government struggled to explain how a simple police action to restore colonial obedience had escalated into a global war that threatened British dominance of world trade and naval supremacy. British military commanders in America found themselves fighting a war they could no longer hope to win through conventional means. The capture of major cities like New York and Philadelphia, once seen as decisive strategic objectives, proved meaningless when the countryside remained under American control, and European allies provided the rebels with unlimited resources and support. The British Army, no matter how professionally led or courageously fought, simply lacked the manpower to occupy and control the vast American territory, while simultaneously defending other imperial possessions. The psychological impact of Saratoga extended far beyond North America, inspiring independence movements and anti-British sentiment throughout the empire. Irish patriots took heart from American success and intensified their own struggles for greater autonomy. Colonial populations from the Caribbean to the Indian subcontinent began to question British invincibility and consider their own possibilities for resistance or rebellion. French participation in the war, made possible by American demonstration of military competence at Saratoga, proved decisive in ways that extended beyond immediate military support. The French Navy's challenge to British control of American waters culminated in the Battle of the Chesapeake in 1781, which prevented British naval forces from relieving Lord Cornwallis at Yorktown. That final British surrender, which effectively ended the Revolutionary War, was a direct consequence of the alliance forged in the aftermath of Saratoga. The financial costs of the expanded war ultimately proved unsustainable for all participants, but the consequences were most severe for the losing side. Britain's national debt soared to unprecedented levels, while France's expenditures on American alliance contributed to the fiscal crisis that would eventually trigger the French Revolution. The American victory at Saratoga had thus set in motion a chain of events that would reshape not only North America, but European civilization itself. For the United States, Saratoga represented validation of the revolutionary experiment in ways that extended beyond military success. The victory proved that American soldiers could defeat professional European armies, that American diplomats could navigate the complex world of international politics, and that American ideals of liberty and self-governance could inspire support among the world's most sophisticated powers. The psychological confidence gained at Saratoga would sustain the new nation through the challenges of independence and westward expansion. The battle's legacy lived on in American military tradition and national mythology. The names of heroes like Benedict Arnold before his later treason, Daniel Morgan, and Horatio Gates became part of American folklore, while the image of brave colonials defeating British regulars in the wilderness became a defining moment in the national story. Saratoga proved that Americans could not only declare independence, but fight successfully to defend it against the world's greatest military power. Most significantly, the victory at Saratoga demonstrated that the American Revolution was not merely a colonial rebellion, but a transformative moment in world history, by proving that European-style professional armies could be defeated by citizen soldiers fighting for their homeland, and by triggering the alliance that made ultimate victory possible. Saratoga ensured that the ideals of the American Revolution would survive to inspire future generations struggling for freedom and self-determination around the globe. The shots fired in the New York wilderness had indeed been heard around the world, and their echoes would resonate through centuries of human progress toward liberty and democracy.